My ruthless billionaire ex-husband brought his mistress home on Christmas Boxing Day. He never expected the baby I carried in. I stood with my 3-month-old daughter in my arms, face to face with the billionaire ex-husband who had no idea he was a father. Snow fell around us as he stared at the baby, his face draining of color. "Julian," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Meet your daughter." "That's not possible," he whispered, his steel-gray eyes flicking from the baby to me. "The timing suggests otherwise," I replied. Behind him, a tall woman in a crimson dress appeared, her hand possessively sliding onto his arm. "Julian, darling, everyone's asking where you've..." She froze when she spotted me. "Vivian," Julian said without looking at her, "give us a moment. Was this why you left?" he demanded once she retreated inside. "To keep my child from me?" "No," I said. "I left because I found the divorce papers you were preparing. The emails discussing how to minimize your exposure in our separation. The plans you made with your father to replace me before I even knew our marriage was over. If you've ever discovered someone you trusted was living a double life, or had to make the impossible decision to protect someone you love at all costs, this story will break your heart before putting it back together." The snow fell steadily around me as I stood at the edge of the long, winding driveway leading to what was once my home. Each flake melting against my wool coat felt like another second ticking down to a confrontation I had rehearsed 100 times in my head but still wasn't prepared for. 3 months since the divorce papers were finalized. 6 months since I'd walked away. 18 months since anything between us had felt genuine. The baby in my arms stirred, her tiny face scrunching against the December chill. I shifted her closer to my chest, trying to shield her from more than just the cold. "This is a mistake," I whispered, half to myself, half to little Sophia bundled against me. "But we're out of options now." From inside the vast limestone mansion came the sounds of laughter, music, the familiar cadence of a Boxing Day party in full swing. Julian always loved hosting the day after Christmas when everyone else was recovering from family obligations. He'd gather the social elite for what he called the celebration that actually matters. Champagne would flow endlessly, business deals would crystallize in hushed corners, and Julian Reed would be at the center of it all, magnetic and untouchable. I hadn't been invited. Not that I expected to be. Ex-wives rarely make the guest list, especially when they leave without explanation, especially when the divorce settlement involves ironclad confidentiality agreements that protect family secrets worth billions. Yet here I stood in the gathering darkness, about to crash his carefully orchestrated event because sometimes even the most impenetrable contracts have loopholes. Sometimes those loopholes are swaddled in pink and have your eyes. If you've ever had to stand alone against someone with all the power, all the resources, all the connections, hit that like button now. Because this story isn't just about a marriage that died or a baby born in secret, it's about finding the courage to demand recognition in a world that would rather you disappear. The mansion looked exactly as I remembered, windows glowing with warmth while snow gathered on the immaculate grounds. Security cameras tracked my approach, their small red lights blinking in the darkness. I knew my presence had already been noted, catalogued, reported. Julian's head of security would be alerting him now. I had perhaps 2 minutes before he appeared. I shifted Sophia in my arms and walked up the heated pathway to the front door, each step feeling like crossing a border between worlds, from the modest life I'd built for us into the gilded cage I'd escaped. Before I could ring the bell, the massive oak door swung open. Julian Reed stood framed in the doorway, champagne flute in hand, expression transforming from practiced charm to cold shock as his gaze locked with mine, then dropped to the bundle in my arms. "Olivia." My name in his mouth still sounded like a claim. "This is unexpected." "That was rather the point," I replied, finding strange comfort in how steady my voice remained. Behind him, a woman appeared, willowy, elegant in a crimson dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She placed a manicured hand on Julian's arm with the casual possessiveness of someone who believes they've won a prize. "Julian, darling, everyone's asking where you've disappeared to." She stopped, noticing me. "Oh." I recognized her immediately. Vivian Taylor, heiress to Taylor Pharmaceuticals. The woman who had been in our bed before I had even moved out. The strategic alliance his father had recommended. The perfect corporate merger wrapped in Valentino. "Vivian," Julian said without looking at her, "give us a moment." To her credit, she seemed to understand the gravity of whatever was unfolding. With a coolly curious glance at the baby, she retreated into the house. Julian's eyes never left mine. 6 months of silence and you show up on Boxing Day with a... He paused, unable to form the word, eyes fixed on Sophia's sleeping face. "A baby," I finished for him. "Your baby." The color drained from his face. For a man who controlled markets with a single decision, who never revealed a thought he hadn't carefully calculated, the naked shock was almost satisfying. "That's not possible. The timing suggests otherwise." Julian's gaze hardened. "We're not having this conversation on my doorstep. Come inside." The grand foyer swallowed us, the sounds of the party muffled behind closed doors to the right. Guests wouldn't be permitted to witness this particular drama. Julian Reed managed his image too carefully for that. He led me to his study in the one room in the house that had been truly his, where he'd spent countless nights working while I slept alone upstairs. The familiar scent of leather and sandalwood wrapped around me as he closed the door. "Let me see," he demanded, setting his champagne down with deliberate control. I shifted Sophia, unwrapping her just enough to reveal her face. At 3 months old, she was still in that malleable stage of babyhood, features soft and undefined. But there was no mistaking the Reed family jawline, the particular arch of her eyebrows. And when her eyes opened, sleepy and unfocused, they were Julian's steel gray, the same eyes that had made me fall in love 6 years ago, before I understood what those eyes were capable of seeing and not seeing. "Her name is Sophia," I said, rewrapping her against the chill. Julian stared, something unreadable passing across his face. "Why now?" His voice was quiet, dangerous. "Why not tell me when you left? Why wait until I'm rebuilding my life to drop this particular bomb?" "Rebuilding your life?" I couldn't help the bitter laugh. "You had Vivian in our bed before the sheets were cold. Your life never missed a beat. You left me," he snapped, the careful control slipping. "No explanation. No warning. Just gone one morning with half the closet emptied out. And you never wondered why?" Julian ran a hand through his dark hair, the only outward sign of agitation he ever allowed himself. "I wondered every day for 2 weeks. Then I wondered if you'd orchestrated the entire thing for a bigger settlement. I signed away any claim to your fortune. Which made no sense." He moved closer, eyes on Sophia rather than me. "Nothing about your departure made sense." Sophia began to fuss, tiny limbs stretching against her swaddling. I bounced her gently, the movement as natural now as breathing. "She's hungry," I said. Julian looked momentarily lost, a foreign expression on a face more accustomed to certainty. Then his training reasserted itself. "There's a sitting room through there." He gestured to a side door. "You can take care of her needs." The sitting room was smaller, more intimate than the study. Where his workspace spoke of power and control, this room with its comfortable chairs and shelves of books he'd actually read rather than collected for show hinted at the man few people ever saw. I'd fallen in love with that man, the one who read poetry when he thought no one was looking, who had vulnerabilities he buried beneath ruthless business acumen. I sat in a velvet armchair, arranging Sophia to nurse. Julian remained standing near the doorway, his back half turned as if offering privacy while being unable to step completely away. "I need to know why you kept this from me," he said finally. The story wasn't simple. It never is when you've loved someone deeply enough to think you know them, only to discover you've been looking at a carefully constructed facade. I had left because staying meant slowly disappearing, becoming another asset in Julian Reed's portfolio, valued but ultimately fungible. "I was pregnant when I left," I began. "I found out the morning after the Morgan acquisition dinner." He nodded, remembering. The night his company had absorbed a competitor, the night we'd celebrated with rare passion, the night before I discovered the emails. You were planning to divorce me anyway, I continued. The consultations with attorneys, the revised prenuptial agreement, the emails with your father about how to minimize exposure in the separation. His head snapped toward me, though his eyes carefully avoided my partially exposed chest where Sophia fed. You accessed my private correspondence. Your password was my birthday. Not exactly Fort Knox. Julian's jaw tightened. Those conversations were preliminary. Contingency planning. For what contingency? Our marriage was perfect on paper. I stroked Sophia's cheek as she nursed. The socialite wife who knew when to speak and when to smile silently. The appropriate background, the right connections. I played my part flawlessly. Then why leave? Because I wanted a marriage, not a merger. The words emerged sharper than I intended. I was 24 when we met Julian. Young enough to be dazzled by you, by the lifestyle, by what I thought was love. By 30, I'd grown up enough to see the transaction for what it was. He moved to the window, shoulders rigid under his perfectly tailored suit. Outside, snow continued to fall, insulating the world in white silence. And the baby? Was keeping her from me punishment? No. I shifted Sophia to my shoulder, patting her back gently. It was protection. From what? Her father. From becoming a reed. From being shaped and molded into whatever the family decided was most advantageous. I met his gaze directly. You told me once that childhood is when a person learns their value in the marketplace. Do you remember that? A flicker of something recognition, perhaps regret crossed his face. You were raised to see yourself as an asset first, a person second, I continued. Every achievement measured by its contribution to the Reed legacy. I didn't want that for her. Julian was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice held none of its usual command. Why come back now? Why today of all days? The question hung between us, heavy with implications. Why crash his Boxing Day party? Why bring this private revelation into the most public of settings? Because she deserves to know her father. And you deserve to know her. I stood, Sophia now quiet against my shoulder. And because in 3 days, I'm moving to Vienna for a job. I wanted you to have the chance to decide what role you want in her life before we go. Vienna. The word fell like a stone. You're taking my daughter to another continent. Unless you give me a reason not to. His eyes narrowed. The businessman reasserting control. Is this a negotiation, Olivia? Everything's a negotiation with you, Julian. That's the problem. If you've ever felt your worth reduced to what you can provide rather than who you are, comment undervalued below. Because sometimes the most painful betrayals aren't the obvious ones, they're the slow erosion of your humanity until you're nothing but an entry on someone's balance sheet. A sharp knock interrupted us. Without waiting for a response, Vivian entered, her perfect composure showing the first signs of strain. Julian, people are noticing your absence. Her gaze flicked between us, lingering on the baby. Should I make excuses, or are you rejoining your guests? The moment crystallized the choice before him: the carefully constructed life he'd rebuilt after my departure, or the messy, complicated reality I'd just introduced. Vivian represented everything that made sense in his world. Strategic alliances, mutual benefit, clear terms. I represented the unquantifiable emotions that couldn't be balanced on a spreadsheet, a child whose value couldn't be calculated in future returns. Give me 10 minutes, Julian said, not looking at her. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Your father is asking questions. Of course he was. Harold Reed wouldn't tolerate disruptions to the narrative, especially not in the form of an ex-wife and an unplanned grandchild. 10 minutes, Vivian, Julian repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. When the door closed behind her, Julian approached slowly, his eyes fixed on Sophia. May I? he asked, extending his hands with uncharacteristic hesitation. I placed our daughter in his arms, watching as he adjusted his hold with awkward care. Sophia blinked up at him, unimpressed by the billionaire CEO now cradling her as if she might shatter. She has your eyes, I said softly. And your stubbornness, I imagine. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. She hasn't started crying at the sight of me, which shows remarkable restraint. The glimpse of humor that private side of him I'd once treasured caught me off guard. Julian, I began, unsure what I was even asking for. He looked up from Sophia's face, and for a moment, I saw past the calculated exterior to the man who might have been if life had shaped him differently. I have 150 guests waiting, he said. My father, business partners, Vivian, all expecting the performance to continue. And it will, I replied, reaching for Sophia. We won't disrupt your evening further. His arms tightened slightly, not releasing her. That's not what I'm saying. He took a breath, seeming to make a decision. Wait here. Before I could respond, he was gone, taking Sophia with him. Panic-flared Julian had never been predictable when challenged, and I just delivered the ultimate challenge to his carefully ordered existence. I moved toward the door, then stopped, forcing myself to breathe. Whatever Julian Reed might be, he wouldn't harm his own child. 10 minutes stretched to 15, then 20. I paced the small sitting room, anxiety building with each passing moment. When the door finally opened, I braced for security guards, for lawyers, for some calculated Reed solution to the problem I represented. Instead, Julian entered alone, without Sophia. Where is she? I demanded, fear sharpening my voice, with my mother. His tone was calm, reassuring. She's more experienced with infants than either of us. Eleanor Reed, the elegant matriarch who had always treated me with polite distance, was not who I would have chosen as Sophia's first babysitter. You told your mother? I told everyone. The words didn't immediately register. What? I went back to the party, with our daughter, and I told everyone that she is mine. He moved closer, his expression more open than I'd seen in years. I introduced her as Sophia Reed. The shock must have shown on my face, because he continued, not the approach you expected from me, I imagine. No, I admitted. I expected lawyers. Custody agreements. NDAs. Those will come. A hint of the pragmatic businessman resurfaced. But first, I needed to make a choice. A choice. Between the life I've constructed and the life that matters. He gestured to the door, beyond which lay his party, his guests, the carefully orchestrated world of Julian Reed, billionaire. I've spent 38 years building something that looks perfect from the outside. You showed me it was hollow. 6 years earlier, I never would have imagined standing in Julian Reed's study as his ex-wife. 6 years earlier, I was just a woman working 3 jobs to put myself through graduate school, with no connection to the world of corporate dynasties and billion-dollar deals. 6 years earlier, I was Olivia Bennett, making ends meet and dreaming of a career in art restoration, not marriage to one of America's most eligible bachelors. But life has a way of taking unexpected turns, and mine pivoted dramatically the night I was working as a server at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's annual fundraising gala. I wasn't supposed to be there at all. I had picked up an extra shift for a coworker who'd gotten sick, desperately needing the money for next semester's tuition. The catering company had strict rules: invisible service, no engaging with guests unless spoken to, no lingering in one area too long. I was following all of them until I made the mistake of pausing too long in front of a restored Degas. The brushwork is remarkable, isn't it? The voice came from behind me, deep and smooth as aged whiskey. I turned to find a man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo standing closer than I'd expected. His eyes were steel gray, his dark hair swept back with just enough imperfection to suggest it had been artfully arranged that way. I'm sorry, sir, I said, immediately slipping into server mode. Can I get you another drink? He smiled, amused. You can tell me what you think of the restoration work first. The colors seem a shade too vibrant compared to Degassa's usual palette, don't you think? It was a test, and we both knew it. He was expecting me to fumble, to admit I was just a server who'd gotten distracted by something shiny. Instead, I surprised him. Actually, the vibrancy is accurate. What appears enhanced is simply the result of removing decades of yellowed varnish. The original colors have been revealed, not altered. The conservator did an exceptional job maintaining the integrity of Degassa's intended color harmony. His eyebrows lifted slightly. That's an impressively specific observation for someone passing out champagne. I have a master's degree in art conservation. Or I will, once I finish paying for it. The champagne helps with that. He laughed then, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. Julian Reed, he said, extending his hand. I knew the name, of course. Everyone in New York knew the Reed's old money was made new again through Julian's aggressive tech investments and corporate takeovers. His family foundation was sponsoring the very exhibition we stood in. Olivia Bennett, I replied, briefly shaking his hand before returning to professionalism. Now, can I get you that drink, Mr. Reed? I'd rather you get yourself one and tell me more about conservation techniques. His eyes held mine, challenging and interested all at once. When's your break? I don't get breaks during events like this, and I need this job. Then I'll speak with your supervisor. He started to scan the room. Please don't, I said quickly. I'll be fired. For talking about art at an art fundraiser. He seemed genuinely confused. For talking to someone like you instead of serving someone like you. Something in his expression shifted then, a momentary glimpse behind the confident facade. He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. My private number, he said, handing it to me. When you finish tonight, call me. I'd like to continue our conversation about Degas. Or conservation. Or why someone with your knowledge of fine art is serving drinks to people who can barely tell a Monet from a Manet. I should have thrown the card away. I knew even then that Julian Reed and I existed in different worlds, operated under different rules. But curiosity and yes, attraction made me slip it into my pocket instead. If you've ever met someone who changed the trajectory of your life in an instant, someone whose gravitational pull was too strong to resist even when warning bells were ringing, hit that subscribe button now. Because sometimes the most transformative connections are also the most dangerous. I called him that night, against my better judgment, expecting his voicemail. Instead, he answered on the second ring. Olivia Bennett, I presume. His voice was even more compelling without the background noise of the gala. How did you know it was me? I don't give my private number to many people, and none of them would be calling at 1 in the morning that I just finished my shift, I explained. And honestly, I didn't expect you to answer. Yet you called anyway. His tone was amused. That suggests either remarkable confidence or remarkable curiosity. Which is it? Maybe both. Or maybe I'm just sleep-deprived and making poor decisions. He laughed again, that same genuine sound from earlier. Have breakfast with me tomorrow. It wasn't a question, and I found myself both irritated and intrigued by his assumption that I would say yes. I have class at 8. Perfect. I'll pick you up at 6:30. There's a place in the East Village that makes the best brioche French toast you'll ever taste. Are you always this presumptuous? Usually more so. He paused. Is that a no, Miss Bennett? There was something in the way he said my name, respectful yet intimate, that made me reconsider my instinctive rejection that it's not a no. But I can meet you there. Just send me the address. I prefer to drive you. His tone softened slightly. But I'll respect your boundaries if that's your preference. It is. Very well. He named a small cafe I'd passed dozens of times but never entered, the kind of place that didn't post prices on its menu because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. I'll see you at 6:30, Olivia. The way he said my first name sent a shiver through me that I tried very hard to ignore. I arrived at the cafe the next morning having slept barely 3 hours, wearing the nicest outfit I owned that was still appropriate for my conservation lab, later dark jeans, a silk blouse I'd found at a consignment shop, and ankle boots that had seen better days. I'd told myself repeatedly on the subway ride that this was a mistake, that men like Julian Reed didn't seriously pursue women who served drinks at their charity events. He was already there, sitting at a corner table, reading something on his tablet. The casual elegance of his appearance made my carefully selected outfit feel shabby in comparison. His charcoal sweater probably cost more than my monthly rent. When he looked up and saw me, something flickered in those gray eyes, surprise, perhaps, that I'd actually come, or appreciation for what he saw. He stood as I approached, a gesture of old-world courtesy that seemed at odds with his reputation as a ruthless corporate raider. "You came," he said simply. "I keep my commitments, even impulsive ones. A valuable quality." He pulled out my chair. One increasingly rare in my experience. The breakfast was surreal, the most expensive French toast I'd ever eaten, served in a cafe where the staff seemed to know Julian by name, while we discussed everything from art conservation ethics to growing up in vastly different circumstances. He listened when I talked about my scholarship to NYU, my work-study program, the 3 jobs I juggled to make ends meet. I listened when he described the weight of family expectations, the loneliness of corporate success, the rarity of genuine conversations in his world. By the time I needed to leave for class, something had shifted between us. What had begun as an intriguing diversion had become something more substantial, a connection neither of us had anticipated. "I should go," I said, checking the time. "My professor doesn't accept billion-dollar acquaintances as excuses for tardiness." Julian smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually guarded features. "When can I see you again?" I hesitated, the practical part of my brain screaming caution. "You know this can't go anywhere, right? Your world and mine don't exactly overlap." "They're overlapping right now," he pointed out. "And I'd like them to continue doing so." "Why?" I challenged him directly. "What could you possibly want with an art student who serves drinks at your charity events?" His answer surprised me with its sincerity. "Someone who looks at a Degas and sees beyond the surface to what's been carefully restored. Someone who calls me on my presumptions instead of catering to them." He leaned forward slightly. "Someone who makes me feel like Julian, not Julian Reed." I wasn't prepared for the vulnerability in his voice, or for my own response to it. Despite every rational argument against it, I agreed to see him again. And again. And again after that. Our courtship was as unexpected as our meeting Julian Reed, heir to one of New York's most powerful families, pursuing a graduate student with determination and focus usually reserved for corporate acquisitions. He sent books on art conservation to my apartment, took me to private viewings at museums after hours, listened with genuine interest to my passionate explanations of pigment degradation and canvas restoration. For 6 months, we existed in a bubble of our own making. He never took me to society events or introduced me to his business associates. I never brought him to gatherings with my friends or mentioned him to my professors. We met in quiet restaurants, hidden corners of the city, his rarely used brownstone in the West Village. It felt like a secret, precious world built just for us. Then came the night everything changed. Julian had been unusually quiet during dinner, his mind clearly elsewhere despite his attempts to focus on our conversation. "What's wrong?" I finally asked as we walked along the Hudson River afterward, the city lights reflecting on the water. He stopped walking, turning to face me. "My father wants to meet you." 5 simple words that burst our carefully constructed bubble. Harold Reed didn't casually meet his son's girlfriends, he evaluated potential additions to the family portfolio. "Why now?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "He's heard rumors." Julian's jaw tightened. "Someone saw us at the Guggenheim last week. And this is a problem because..." "It's not." His hand found mine, fingers intertwining. "But it means decisions need to be made. About us. About where this is going. Where do you want it to go? I challenged, heart hammering in my chest. Julian Reed, master of boardroom negotiations, looked momentarily uncertain. In the 6 months we'd been together, we'd never discussed a future beyond our next meeting. We'd never labeled what was happening between us or acknowledged the growing feelings neither of us had planned for. I want you in my life, Olivia. Permanently. The words hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us fully understood yet. I knew that entering Julian's world would mean sacrificing the anonymity that had protected our relationship thus far. I knew that Olivia Bennett, art conservator, would become Olivia Reed, socialite wife, with all the expectations and limitations that entailed. What I didn't know then was how completely that transformation would consume me. How thoroughly the woman I was would disappear into the role I was expected to play. How the man who looked at me with such vulnerability that night would gradually be replaced by the heir his father had always demanded. Have you ever watched yourself slowly disappear, replaced piece by piece with someone you barely recognize? Comment fading away if you've ever lost yourself trying to become what someone else needed you to be. Meeting the Reed family was like walking onto the set of a play where everyone knew their lines except me. Eleanor Reed, Julian's mother, welcomed me to their Upper East Side mansion with perfect courtesy and calculating eyes. Harold Reed made no attempt to disguise his assessment of me from my educational background to my family connections to my physical appearance. Everything was weighed and measured against some invisible standard. We sat in a formal dining room that could have been featured in Architectural Digest, surrounded by artwork worth more than everything I'd ever owned combined. The conversation flowed smoothly on the surface, polite questions about my studies, my career goals, my upbringing. Beneath that surface ran currents of judgment I could feel but couldn't quite grasp. Art conservation is a fascinating field, Eleanor said, cutting her Dover sole with surgical precision. Though hardly lucrative, I imagine. It's not about the money, I replied, then immediately regretted the cliché. Harold's laugh was short and sharp. Everything is about money, my dear. Even the luxury of pretending it isn't. Julian placed his hand over mine on the table, a silent show of support. Olivia's work is about preserving beauty and history for future generations. There's value beyond financial returns. Of course, his father conceded smoothly. Cultural capital has its place in a diversified portfolio. That phrase cultural capital stayed with me long after dinner ended. To Harold Reed, even beauty and history were assets to be acquired, maintained, and leveraged. Nothing existed outside the realm of transactions and returns. Later that night, in Julian's apartment, I voiced my concerns. Your father sees everything as a business opportunity, doesn't he? Even people. Julian sighed, loosening his tie. That's how he built Reed Enterprises from a respectable family business into a global empire. By recognizing value where others see only sentiment. And what do you see when you look at me? I asked, suddenly needing to know. Value or sentiment? He crossed the room, taking my face in his hands. I see the woman I love. The future I want. It was the first time he'd said those words I love you, and they washed away my doubts like a tide over footprints in sand. I should have known that when the tide recedes, the sand is never quite the same. The proposal came 2 months later, romantic in its execution but strategic in its timing. A private dinner on the rooftop of his building, the Manhattan skyline glittering around us like earthbound stars. Julian on one knee, offering a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a flawless diamond that captured and reflected light in hypnotic patterns. Olivia Bennett, he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes, you've shown me possibilities I never knew existed. A life beyond spreadsheets and shareholder meetings. I want to build that life with you. Will you marry me? In that moment, all my reservations seemed insignificant compared to the love I felt for him. I said yes without hesitation, believing that what we had would be strong enough to withstand the pressure of the world we were about to enter together. The engagement announcement in the New York Times described me as an art scholar from a modest but respectable background, emphasizing my academic achievements rather than my working-class origins. The Reed family's PR team quietly began reshaping my public image: new wardrobe, new hairstyle, new social connections carefully cultivated at events where I was introduced as Julian's fiancée rather than as Olivia in my own right. Julian seemed oblivious to these subtle changes, or perhaps he simply saw them as necessary adjustments to our new reality. When I mentioned my discomfort with the makeover being orchestrated around me, he kissed my forehead and assured me it was temporary. Just until the wedding, he promised. The media circus will die down after that, and you can go back to being you. But the version of me that emerged from that circus was already different, polished, filtered, acceptable to the world Julian inhabited. I began to lose track of where the performance ended and the real Olivia began. The wedding was a spectacle worthy of the Reed name: 500 guests at St. Patrick's Cathedral, reception at the Plaza, coverage in Vogue and Town and Country. I floated through it like a dream, smiling when prompted, dancing with perfect strangers, accepting congratulations from people whose names blurred together in a haze of important connections. "You're doing wonderfully," Eleanor whispered during a rare quiet moment, adjusting the fall of my veil. "Harold is pleased with how you've risen to the occasion." It was meant as a compliment, I knew, but it landed like a verdict. I had passed some test I hadn't realized I was taking. The honeymoon 3 weeks in the Reed family's private villa on the Amalfi Coast was the last time I remember Julian and I truly being ourselves together. Away from New York, away from Harold's influence and Eleanor's watchful eye, we rediscovered the connection that had brought us together in the first place. We talked for hours about books and art and dreams. We made love on sun-warmed terraces overlooking the Mediterranean. We laughed without restraint and argued passionately about meaningless things. "I never want to leave," I admitted on our final night, wrapped in his arms under a sky scattered with stars. "Then let's stay," he suggested, nuzzling my neck. "I can run the Asian division from here just as easily as from New York." For a moment, I believed him. For a moment, I thought we might escape the future that awaited us back home. But reality intruded in the form of his ringing phone: "Harold," with an urgent situation that required Julian's immediate attention. We returned to New York the next day, and the Julian who had proposed to me, who had honeymooned with me, began to fade. In his place emerged Julian Reed, heir and executive, increasingly consumed by the demands of the family empire. Our first year of marriage established patterns that would define the next 5. Julian worked 16-hour days, attending meetings, closing deals, expanding the Reed influence across new markets. I managed our social calendar, served on charity boards, hosted dinner parties for people Julian needed to impress. We lived parallel lives that occasionally intersected in moments of physical intimacy that grew increasingly disconnected from emotional connection. It wasn't that Julian stopped loving me, at least, not at first. It was that loving me became just one of many responsibilities he juggled, and not always the most pressing. When I completed my degree and was offered a position at the Metropolitan Museum's Conservation Department, he seemed genuinely proud. But when scheduling conflicts arose between my work and the social obligations of being Mrs. Julian Reed, there was never any question about which would take priority. "You can restore paintings anytime," he said when I expressed disappointment at missing an important project. "The governor's fundraiser happens once a year." Gradually, I set aside my career aspirations in favor of being the wife Julian needed: elegant, sophisticated, conversant enough in business matters to charm his associates but never so opinionated as to challenge their perspectives. I became exactly what Harold had wanted from the beginning: a valuable asset in the Reed portfolio. The irony was that as I became more perfect in my assigned role, Julian seemed to value me less. The woman he had fallen in love with, passionate, independent, occasionally defiant, had been replaced by a carefully constructed facade that matched his own. We became reflections of expectations rather than genuine partners. By our 5th anniversary, the cracks in our marriage had become chasms too wide to bridge with weekend getaways or expensive gifts. Julian's work had expanded to include frequent international travel. I filled my days with charity committees and gallery openings, constructing a life that looked enviable from the outside while feeling increasingly hollow within. It might have continued indefinitely, this elegant facade of a marriage, if not for the Morgan acquisition dinner and what followed. Some endings arrive suddenly, like buildings collapsing in earthquakes. Others happen slowly, foundation crumbling beneath seemingly solid structures until one day, everything falls away at once. The Morgan Technologies acquisition had been Julian's obsession for months, a mid-sized software company with proprietary algorithms that would give Reed Enterprises a significant advantage in predictive market analysis. Harold considered it too speculative, but Julian had pushed forward against his father's reservations, staking his reputation on the deal's success. When Morgan finally capitulated after a particularly aggressive takeover strategy, Julian was triumphant. The celebration dinner at our penthouse apartment brought together the key players in the acquisition: lawyers, board members, financial analysts who had worked around the clock to make it happen. I played my role perfectly, the gracious hostess who knew when to engage and when to fade into the background, making everyone feel welcome while ensuring Julian remained the center of attention. It was the first time in months I'd seen genuine excitement in my husband's eyes. As the evening progressed and guests gradually departed, that excitement shifted focus from professional achievement to more intimate celebration. "You were amazing tonight," Julian murmured as he helped me clear the last glasses from the living room, everyone else having left or retired to guest rooms. "I couldn't have done this without you." The admission is so rare, so validating, caught me off guard. I looked up to find him watching me with an intensity one hadn't seen in years, as if really seeing me for the first time in too long. The Julian who made love to me that night felt like the man I had married, present, passionate, connected in ways that transcended the physical. For those hours, the masks we both wore fell away, revealing the people we had been before expectations and obligations had reshaped us. When I fell asleep in his arms, I dared to hope that something fundamental had shifted, that we might find our way back to each other. I woke alone the next morning, Julian's side of the bed already cold. The familiar disappointment settled over me as I reached for my phone, checking the time. 7:30. He would already be in his home office, making calls to capitalize on the previous night's success. I scrolled through my emails, a habit formed from years of managing our social obligations, when a notification appeared from Julian's account. His personal and business emails were synced to my device for scheduling purposes, a practical arrangement that had never seemed invasive until that moment. The subject line caught my attention: Reed Separation Strategy. It was addressed to Harold and their family attorney, dated 3 weeks earlier. With growing horror, I opened the message, telling myself there must be some explanation, some business context I was missing. There wasn't. "Father," the email began, "following our discussion about the future of my personal arrangements, I've consulted with James regarding the most advantageous approach to minimizing exposure in the separation. He agrees that timing is critical, ideally after the Morgan acquisition is complete but before the Asian expansion announcement in Q4. The email continued, clinical and detached, discussing prenuptial enforcement strategies, asset protection measures, and public relations management for the transition. My name appeared exactly once, in a sentence about ensuring Olivia receives fair compensation for her contributions without compromising core Reed holdings. Fair compensation. Like a long-term employee being downsized. Like a business partnership being dissolved. I read the email 3 times, each reading more painful than the last. The final paragraph contained the most damning revelation: RICO. Mendations for introducing Julian's new partner to key social circles with minimal disruption to business relationships. The name wasn't specified, but the implication was clear: my replacement had already been identified, perhaps even approached. The bedroom suddenly felt airless, the luxury that surrounded me suffocating rather than comforting. I moved on autopilot to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face as if it might wash away what I just learned. When I looked in the mirror, a stranger stared back at me, a perfectly groomed woman whose purpose was about to become obsolete. I might have confronted Julian immediately, demanded explanations, fought for the marriage I thought we still had beneath the performance. But as I stood there, hands gripping the marble counter, a wave of nausea rolled through me, sudden, intense, undeniable. I barely made it to the toilet before losing what little remained in my stomach from the previous night's dinner. As I knelt on the heated floor tiles, a realization dawned with terrible clarity: this wasn't the first morning I'd felt this way. I had attributed the occasional nausea to stress, the missed periods to the same. But now, with the evidence of Julian's planned exit before me, a new possibility emerged. I sat on the bathroom floor for what felt like hours, connecting dots that had been there all along. The fatigue I couldn't shake. The tenderness that made even Julian's passionate attention the night before slightly uncomfortable. The emotional volatility I'd blamed on growing dissatisfaction with our marriage. When I finally gathered the strength to stand, I knew what I had to do before confronting Julian about anything else. The pregnancy test was hidden in the back of my drawer, purchased months earlier during a brief period when we discussed the possibility of starting a family. Julian had ultimately decided the timing wasn't right, too many critical business expansions on the horizon, too much uncertainty in the global markets. The test had remained unused, a small symbol of yet another dream deferred to accommodate Reed Enterprises' strategic timeline. 3 minutes later, I stared at 2 pink lines that changed everything. Pregnant. The word echoed in my mind as I sat on the edge of the bathtub, test still in hand. Julian's child. A baby that would be born into the Reed family legacy, raised with the same expectations that had shaped Julian into a man who could discuss divorcing his wife with the same clinical detachment he brought to business acquisitions. A child who would learn, as Julian had learned, that their value was measured by their contribution to the Reed empire. That relationships were strategic alliances to be maintained when beneficial and dissolved when more advantageous options appeared. That everything and everyone had a price, a utility, an expiration date. In that moment, staring at those 2 pink lines, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not bring my child into that world. I would not watch another generation learn to wear masks so convincing they forgot their own faces beneath them. I would leave. The decision to leave Julian wasn't impulsive, it was the culmination of 1,000 small surrenders, 1,000 moments when I had chosen his world over my own identity. Standing in our bathroom with a positive pregnancy test in one hand and evidence of my husband's betrayal in the other, I finally saw with perfect clarity what I had refused to acknowledge for years. Julian had never wanted a partner. He had wanted an asset, beautiful, accomplished, socially adept to complement the empire he was building. And I had become exactly that, surrendering pieces of myself so gradually I hardly noticed their absence until almost nothing remained. But now there was someone else to consider. Someone whose future would be shaped by the decisions I made in this moment. Someone who deserved more than to be another perfectly polished cog in the Reed family machine. If you've ever had to make an impossible choice to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves, hit the like button right now. Because sometimes the most courageous decisions look like running away to those who don't understand what you're running from. I had a window of opportunity that morning. Julian would be locked in conference calls for hours, reviewing the Morgan acquisition details with international teams. By the time he emerged from his office, I needed to be gone completely, irrevocably gone in a way that would prevent him from finding me before I was ready to be found. The plan formed with surprising clarity as adrenaline cleared the fog of shock. I would need cash that couldn't be traced through credit card statements or bank withdrawals. I would need somewhere to go that wasn't connected to my known associates or habits. I would need to disappear so completely that even Julian Reed, with all his resources and connections, would struggle to locate me. Most importantly, I would need to ensure that when the divorce inevitably came, it happened on my terms rather than his. I moved through our apartment like a ghost, collecting only what was irreplaceable from my grandmother's locket, photos from before I met Julian, academic credentials I had earned through years of study and sacrifice. Everything else could be replaced. Everything else tied me to a life I was now choosing to leave. In the closet, I bypassed the designer clothes that had been selected to create the perfect Mrs. Reed image, instead grabbing the few remaining pieces from my previous life: jeans, sweaters, comfortable shoes that prioritized function over appearance. I took exactly half the cash from our emergency safe, leaving a perfectly divided stack behind. Not that Julian would notice its absence. The amount represented less than he spent on a single business dinner, but the symbolism mattered to me. I was taking only what could legitimately be considered mine. The most difficult part was what came next. I sat at Julian's desk and composed 3 letters. The first was to our family attorney, formally requesting that divorce proceedings be initiated with the explicit condition that I renounce all claims to Reed family assets beyond what I had brought into the marriage. The second was to Eleanor, brief but honest about why I was leaving and asking for her discretion until matters were legally settled. The third was to Julian himself. I struggled longest with this final letter, writing and discarding multiple drafts before settling on brutal simplicity. Julian, I've seen the separation strategy emails. I know about the plans for your new partner, and the careful timeline you've constructed for replacing me. I'm simply accelerating your schedule. I want nothing from you, not your name, not your money, not the life you designed for us both without my input. By the time you read this, divorce proceedings will already be in motion according to the terms I've outlined to James. Don't look for me. Don't contact me. Whatever we once had has been systematically dismantled by your inability to see me as anything more than an acquisition to be managed and eventually divested when more advantageous options appeared. Goodbye, Olivia. I didn't mention the pregnancy. I couldn't bring myself to use our child as either explanation or leverage. And some small, wounded part of me wanted to deny Julian even the knowledge that he was going to be a father, a petty vengeance against the man who had planned to discard me like a depreciating asset. I left the letters with the building concierge, to be delivered that evening after Julian returned from the office. Then I walked out of the penthouse with nothing but a single suitcase and the determination that my child would never learn to value themselves according to the Reed family metrics of success. My first stop was a bank where I had maintained a small, separate account since before my marriage, the remnants of my independence that Julian had never questioned or monitored. I withdrew everything, closed the account, and used the cash to purchase a prepaid phone and a bus ticket to Philadelphia, where my college roommate Rebecca had moved after graduation. Rebecca took me in without question when I appeared on her doorstep that evening, offering her guest room and a shoulder to cry on as I explained what had happened. She had never approved of Julian, had warned me about the fundamental incompatibility of our values, but there was no satisfaction in her expression as I confirmed her worst predictions. "What are you going to do?" she asked as we sat in her small kitchen, mugs of tea growing cold between us. "Disappear for a while," I said. "Just until the divorce is finalized and I figure out next steps." "And the baby?" I placed a protective hand over my still flat stomach. "The baby comes first. Every decision from now on is about giving them a different path than the one Julian would choose." Rebecca nodded, understanding what I couldn't fully articulate, that I was running not just from a failed marriage but from an entire value system that threatened to consume another generation. "You can stay here as long as you need," she offered. "Roger travels for work most weeks, so it's just me rattling around this place anyway." Roger was Rebecca's husband, a pharmaceutical sales representative whose territory kept him on the road 4 days a week. Their modest 3-bedroom row house felt like a sanctuary compared to the cold perfection of the penthouse I had left behind. "I won't stay long," I promised. "Just until I can find a job and a place of my own." "But first, we need to get you checked out," Rebecca said, practical as always. "When was your last prenatal visit?" The question brought me up short. There hadn't been prenatal visits because until this morning, I hadn't even confirmed the pregnancy. Another wave of reality crashed over me. I wasn't just leaving Julian, I was embarking on single motherhood with all its challenges and uncertainties. "I think that's tomorrow's problem," I said, sudden exhaustion making it difficult to think clearly. "Tonight, I just need to sleep somewhere Julian can't find me." Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every noise outside Rebecca's guest room window startled me awake, certain it was Julian or someone he had sent to bring me back. Even in my exhaustion, I knew how unlikely that Julian Reed didn't chase after people who left him. He simply replaced them and moved forward, adjustments noted in his mental ledger but emotions carefully contained. The first weeks of my new life passed in a blur of practical necessities. I found a job at a small gallery in Philadelphia's art district, using my conservation background but careful to stay away from the high-profile institutions where Julian's connections might identify me. I secured a tiny studio apartment within walking distance of work, furnished it with second-hand pieces that bore no resemblance to the curated luxury I had left behind. I established prenatal care with an obstetrician recommended by Rebecca, using my maiden name for all medical records. Throughout it all, I waited for some indication that Julian was searching for me, a private investigator asking questions, mutual acquaintances reaching out with concerned messages, legal notices beyond the straightforward divorce filings I had initiated. Nothing came. The proceedings moved forward with unsettling efficiency, Julian's legal team accepting my terms without negotiation or contest. It was as if he had simply deleted me from his life, exactly as those emails had outlined, the only deviation from his plan being that I had left on my own terms rather than his scheduled timeline. The divorce was finalized 3 months after I left, the papers arriving at my new address through channels I had established with the attorney. I was officially no longer Olivia Reed, no longer connected to the family whose expectations had nearly erased me. The relief I expected to feel was complicated by a persistent ache, not for the marriage that had failed, but for the love I had once believed in so completely. That same week, I felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings inside me, a reminder that I wasn't alone despite the solitude I had chosen. I pressed my hand against the small swell of my stomach and made a silent promise: you will never question your value beyond what your heart can hold and your mind can dream. You will never be measured by your utility to others. You will be loved for exactly who you are, not what you can provide. 6 months pregnant and beginning to show in ways that couldn't be disguised, I made another difficult decision. Philadelphia was too close to New York, too connected to the circles Julian inhabited. If I truly wanted to ensure my child grew up beyond the Reed influence, I needed to move farther away, establish a life where even accidental encounters would be impossible. An art conservation position opened in Chicago, smaller than I was qualified for, but perfect for my situation. The gallery owner was willing to hire me despite my advanced pregnancy, impressed by my credentials and unaware of my connection to the Reed name I had abandoned. I moved west with growing confidence, establishing a new home in a city where snow fell horizontally off the lake and no one knew I had once been the perfect corporate wife. Sophia Eleanor Bennett arrived on a stormy March night, 2 weeks earlier than expected but perfect in every detail. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and Julian's steel-gray eyes blinking up at me with solemn curiosity. When the nurse placed her in my arms for the first time, the enormity of what I had undertaken hit me with physical force. This tiny person was entirely dependent on me, her future shaped by decisions I would make without input from the father whose DNA she carried in every cell. For a moment, doubt crept in. Should I have told Julian? Should I have given him the chance to be part of his daughter's life? Then Sophia wrapped her tiny hand around my finger, gripping with surprising strength, and the doubt receded. She deserved the chance to become herself before the weight of the Reed legacy could define her path. The first year of Sophia's life tested every resource I possessed: physical, emotional, financial. Balancing single motherhood with full-time work required military-level logistics and left little room for sleep or self-care. The small apartment we shared felt alternately like a haven and a prison as I navigated colic, teething, and the bone-deep exhaustion that came with being someone's entire world. But there were moments of transcendent joy that made the struggle worthwhile. Sophia's first smile, a gummy expression of pure delight that appeared one morning when I sang to her during a diaper change. Her first laugh, a bubbling cascade of sound that erupted when I blew raspberries on her round belly. The weight of her sleeping body against my chest, perfect trust in her complete surrender to slumber. I documented everything in a journal, partly for Sophia to read someday and partly to remind myself why I had chosen this difficult path. Each milestone, each challenge, each moment of connection with my daughter reinforced the rightness of my decision to leave, even as it highlighted the absence of the partner I had once believed Julian would be. Life settled into sustainable rhythms as Sophia grew from infant to toddler. My position at the gallery expanded to include educational programming, increasing both my salary and my professional satisfaction. We moved to a slightly larger apartment with a tiny garden where Sophia could explore the wonders of dirt and worms and growing things. I made friends, other single mothers, colleagues, neighbors who became our chosen family in the absence of biological connections. I had almost convinced myself that the Julian chapter of my life was completely closed when the Vienna opportunity appeared in my inbox, an email from an international art conservation consortium seeking someone to head their new technical research department. The position represented everything I had once aspired to professionally, before marriage and motherhood had rearranged my priorities. The salary was double what I currently earned. The prestige would open doors throughout the art world. The location an ocean away from any possibility of reed entanglement seemed like the final step in securing Sophia's independent future. When the consortium offered me the position following a series of virtual interviews, I accepted with only one reservation. Sophia was now 3 years old, developing her own personality, asking questions about the world with increasing specificity. Soon, she would begin to notice the absence of a father in her life, to compare her family structure with those of her friends, to wonder about the half of her genetics that remained unexplained. No matter how I justified my choices, I couldn't escape the reality that someday Sophia would ask about her father. Someday she would want to know why he wasn't part of her life. Someday she might even seek him out, only to discover that I had denied them both the opportunity to know each other. The thought weighed on me as I prepared for our move to Vienna. I began monitoring Julian's life from a safe distance: business news articles, social media mentions, the occasional society page photograph that appeared despite my efforts to avoid any reminder of the world I had left. What I found confirmed what I had always suspected would happen. Julian had moved on exactly as planned, his life seemingly unaffected by my departure. Reed Enterprises had expanded into new markets. The Asian division Julian had once joked about running from Italy was now a major profit center under his direct oversight. His name appeared regularly in financial publications, always in connection with ambitious acquisitions and strategic partnerships. And then there was Vivian Taylor. Her relationship with Julian became public approximately 1 year after our divorce, exactly the timeline his emails had suggested. The photographs showed them at charity galas, industry events, exclusive resorts, her willowy elegance the perfect complement to his powerful presence. The business press noted the strategic advantages of aligning Reed Enterprises with Taylor Pharmaceuticals, the marriage of medical technology with financial infrastructure creating new opportunities for both families. It was exactly the merger Harold Reed would have orchestrated if given complete control of his son's personal life. It was exactly the future Julian had been planning while still sharing my bed. If you've ever had to watch someone you once loved move on as if you never existed, as if the life you shared was nothing more than a temporary arrangement easily replaced, comment erased below. Because sometimes the most painful part isn't losing someone, it's realizing you never really had them to begin with. The final catalyst for my decision came 3 days before our scheduled departure for Vienna. Sophia and I were having breakfast in our small kitchen, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the garden where spring bulbs were just beginning to emerge. "Mama," Sophia said, carefully spooning yogurt into her mouth with the concentration only a 3-year-old can bring to simple tasks, "where did I come from?" The question wasn't entirely unexpected. She had reached the age of persistent why and how interrogations, but its timing seemed almost cosmically significant. "You grew in my tummy until you were ready to come out and meet the world," I answered, the simplified explanation I had prepared for this inevitable moment. She considered this with serious gray eyes, Julian's eyes, before asking the follow-up I had dreaded. "But Zach says babies need a daddy to start growing. Where's my daddy?" Zach was our neighbor's son, a precocious 4-year-old who delighted in sharing his newly acquired knowledge with anyone who would listen. I had known this conversation was coming, had rehearsed various age-appropriate responses, but in the moment, looking at Sophia's innocent curiosity, none of them seemed adequate. "Your daddy lives far away," I said finally, choosing honesty over comforting fiction. "He doesn't know about you yet." "Why not?" The directness of children can be devastating in its simplicity because Mama made a decision when you were still growing inside me. I wanted you to have a different kind of life than the one he would have chosen for you. Is he a bad person? Alarm flickered across her small features. No, sweetie. He's not bad. He just sees the world very differently than I do. He places value on different things. Sophia nodded as if this made perfect sense, returning to her yogurt with renewed interest. Does he like yogurt? The non sequitur startled a laugh from me, breaking the tension of the moment. I don't know, baby. I haven't seen him in a long time. Maybe we could ask him when we meet him. When, not if. The assumption in her statement lodged in my chest like a stone. For 3 years, I had made decisions based on what I believed was best for Sophia's future, but I had done so without consulting the other person whose genetic material she carried. Without giving Julian the opportunity to be something other than what I feared he would be as a father. The realization was uncomfortable, challenging the narrative I had constructed to justify my choices. Had I really been protecting Sophia, or had I been punishing Julian for failing to be the husband I had wanted? Had I denied my daughter a relationship with her father out of genuine concern for her well-being, or out of wounded pride and bitter disappointment? I had no answers, only the growing certainty that I couldn't take Sophia to Vienna without at least giving Julian the chance to know his daughter existed. Whatever came after that revelation would be his choice to be present or absent, involved or distant, a father in name only or something more meaningful. But the choice had to be his, just as leaving had been mine. Which is how I came to be standing in the snow outside Julian Reed's mansion on Boxing Day, 3 months after that breakfast conversation with Sophia, 3 days before our scheduled flight to Vienna, uncertain whether I was about to make things better or infinitely worse for everyone involved. If you've ever had to humble yourself for the sake of someone you love, to set aside pride and fear in order to do what's right rather than what's easy, subscribe to Mr. Arden's Heart Stories right now. Because the most important journeys often begin with the hardest first step. The scene in Julian's study following his shocking announcement to the party played out like something from someone else's life, not the controlled, strategic Julian Reed I had known, but a man capable of emotional impulse, of choosing connection over appearance, of prioritizing his newly discovered daughter over business considerations. I studied his face, searching for the calculation, the angle. What about Vivian? Your father. The merger with Taylor Pharmaceuticals that's been in the works for months. Vivian will survive. My father will adjust. He shrugged, the gesture almost boyish in its nonchalance. As for business arrangements, they can be renegotiated. Just like that. Nothing about this is just like that, Olivia. His voice roughened. You left without giving me a chance to choose differently. To be different, the accusation hung between us, not entirely unfair. I had discovered his contingency plans and made my own in response. I had taken his daughter without giving him the opportunity to be her father. I thought I knew what you would choose, I said quietly. So did I. He moved to the window again, watching the snow. When I held her just now, I realized how much I've missed by adhering to the Reed blueprint for success. How much I would miss if I let you both walk away again. Julian, I won't stop you from taking the position in Vienna, he interrupted. But I'm asking you to reconsider. Not for me, but for Sophia. For the chance to raise her together, even if we're not together. The proposal was unexpected. In all the scenarios I had imagined for this confrontation, Julian offering compromise had never featured. And if I still go? Then I'll be on a plane to Vienna regularly enough that our daughter never questions my commitment to her. His gaze was direct, unflinching. I won't be the father who prioritizes business over family. I won't repeat my own father's mistakes. The conviction in his voice felt genuine, but Julian had always been convincing. His success was built on making people believe. Words are easy, I said. Especially for you. Then judge me by actions. He stepped closer. Come back to the party. Meet my mother properly this time, not as my wife but as Sophia's mother. See what I've already set in motion. You want me to join your Boxing Day celebration? With Vivian there? Vivian has already left. His mouth quirked. With considerable drama, I should add. My father might follow her example once he finishes berating me for my impulsive announcement. The image was so at odds with the controlled Julian Reed I knew that I almost laughed. You really told everyone? Just like that? I held our daughter in my arms and realized some things matter more than appearance. He extended his hand. Come. See for yourself that I hesitated, then placed my hand in his. Not a reconciliation, not forgiveness, but perhaps the first tentative step towards something new. The main reception room fell silent as we entered. Faces turned, expressions ranging from shocked to calculating to morbidly curious. Eleanor Reed stood near the massive Christmas tree, holding Sophia with surprising competence. She met my gaze with what might have been respect. Julian's father stood nearby, his displeasure radiating like a physical force. Harold Reed had built an empire through ruthless determination and expected his son to preserve and expand it without distraction. Julian, Harold began, his voice low but carrying in the hushed room, this theatrical display is the most important announcement I've ever made. Julian finished, his hand still holding mine. My daughter will know from her first day in this house that she matters more than any business deal. The words hung in the air, a declaration that went beyond our private drama to challenge the very foundations of the Reed Empire. I felt the weight of it, the seismic shift in Julian's carefully constructed world. Eleanor approached, Sophia serene in her arms. She's quite perfect, she said, her gaze moving between Julian and me. Though I would have appreciated learning about my granddaughter under less dramatic circumstances. Dramatic circumstances seem to be our specialty, I replied, surprised when she smiled in response, indeed. She transferred Sophia back to me with careful hands. Perhaps in that, at least, you are well matched. The party gradually resumed around us, the social elite adjusting to the new reality with the adaptability of those accustomed to power shifts. Julian remained beside me, his presence both familiar and strange, the man I had married and someone new emerging simultaneously. The days following that Boxing Day revelation unfolded with a surreal quality, as if we were all actors in a play whose script kept changing. Julian canceled his post-holiday business commitments, delegating responsibilities he would normally have handled personally. He appeared at my hotel the morning after the party, not with lawyers as I had half expected, but with coffee and questions about Sophia's routines, preferences, developmental milestones, all the details of her life he had missed. I watched him with our daughter, searching for signs of the transactional approach I had feared, the measuring of her value against Reed standards of accomplishment and utility. Instead, I saw something I had glimpsed only rarely during our marriage, Julian fully present in a moment, his formidable focus directed not toward acquisition or advantage but toward genuine connection. He sat on the floor of our hotel suite, following Sophia's lead as she showed him her favorite stuffed animal, listening with complete attention as she explained in 3-year-old logic why bears should wear blue shirts instead of red ones. When she fell asleep for her afternoon nap, he watched her with an expression of wonder that made my chest ache with complicated emotion. I don't know how to do this, he admitted quietly as we sat in the hotel room, mugs of room service coffee cooling between us. I don't know how to be a father, especially not to a child I've just met, especially not when her mother has every reason not to trust me with her. At least you recognize the problem, I said, not unkindly. That's more self-awareness than you showed during most of our marriage. He winced but didn't defend himself. I've had 3 years to think about why you left. At first, I was angry, furious, really that you would walk away without explanation, without giving me the chance to fix whatever was wrong. Then I was hurt, though I'd never have admitted it to anyone. Then I started to understand. Understand what? That I had been treating our marriage like a business arrangement, evaluating its performance, calculating its returns, considering strategic alternatives when metrics weren't being met. That I had become exactly what my father raised me to be. Someone who sees relationships as assets to be managed rather than connections to be nurtured. The admission hung between us, more honest than anything he had offered during our years together. So why Vivian? I asked the question that had lingered since seeing her at his door. Why replace me with someone cut from the same cloth as the Reed family tapestry? Julian's smile held no humor. Because she made sense on paper. Because she understood the rules of the game without having to be taught. Because my father approved, and after you left, I fell back into the patterns that had shaped my entire life before you. And now? Now I'm sitting in a hotel room with my ex-wife and the daughter I didn't know existed until yesterday, trying to figure out how to undo decades of conditioning before I lose the chance to be part of her life. The rawness in his voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the Julian who had calculated separation strategies or timed divorce proceedings for minimal business disruption. This was someone I had glimpsed only in rare, unguarded moments during our courtship, the man beneath the Reed heir's carefully constructed persona. Over the next 3 days, as the Vienna departure date approached, Julian and I negotiated the beginnings of a co-parenting relationship neither of us had anticipated. The discussions were sometimes tense, sometimes surprisingly collaborative, always focused on Sophia's well-being rather than our complicated past. "I'm still taking the position," I told him firmly. "This opportunity means too much professionally for me to pass it up." "I understand." He nodded, accepting this without the argument I had expected. "Would you consider a compromise on timing? Perhaps delay the start date by a month, give me time to establish some foundation with Sophia before you're an ocean away." It was a reasonable request, more considerate than I had anticipated. The consortium would likely accommodate a short postponement, especially for family reasons. "I can ask," I conceded. "But I want to be clear about boundaries, Julian. I'm not coming back to New York permanently. I'm not rejoining your world. Whatever relationship you build with Sophia has to exist independent of any expectations about my choices." "Absolutely." His response came without hesitation. "This isn't about us, Olivia. It's about giving Sophia the opportunity to know both her parents, even if those parents live separate lives." The Vienna Compromise was the first of many negotiations as we constructed a framework for sharing Sophia's life across continents. Julian applied his considerable resources to practical solutions. An apartment near mine in Vienna that he would use during his regular visits, video call technology more sophisticated than what I could afford, educational trust arrangements that would secure Sophia's future without controlling her choices. What surprised me most was his willingness to adapt to the values I had established for Sophia's upbringing. When I expressed concern about overindulgence, he agreed to consult with me before any major purchases or experiences. When I emphasized the importance of her understanding the value of work beyond financial reward, he listened without the dismissal I would have expected from the Julian I had known. The true test came the day before our rescheduled departure, when Harold Reed requested a private meeting with both of us. Julian suggested we meet at a neutral location rather than the Reed mansion, another small consideration that acknowledged the power imbalance between his world and mine. The restaurant Harold selected was predictably exclusive, the kind of place where prices never appear on menus and reservation lists mysteriously rearrange themselves to accommodate Reed family requests. I felt underdressed despite wearing the best outfit I had packed, acutely aware of how far I had traveled from the world where such establishments represented normal Tuesday lunches rather than once-in-a-lifetime splurges. Harold arrived exactly on time, immaculate in a suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my salary. His greeting was cool but correct, his attention immediately focusing on Sophia, who sat between Julian and me, contently coloring on the children's menu the maitre d' had provided. "So this is my granddaughter," he said, studying her with the assessing gaze I remembered all too well from my early days with Julian. "She has the Reed eyes." "And the Bennett stubborn streak," Julian added, surprising me with the acknowledgement of my family's contribution to Sophia's makeup. "She's quite her own person already." Harold nodded, neither approving or disapproving, merely cataloging information. "I've had my team review the situation," he began, addressing us both with the brisk efficiency of a board meeting. "They've prepared several options for handling this development with minimal disruption to the Reed Enterprises public profile." "Father," Julian interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't a PR situation to be managed. This is your granddaughter." "Of course," Harold conceded smoothly. "But there are practical considerations. The Taylor merger, for instance, which is now in jeopardy given Vivian's reaction to recent events." "I'm aware of the business implications," Julian replied. "They're significant but not insurmountable." Alternative arrangements can be made that don't involve using my personal life as a negotiating chip. Harold's eyebrows rose fractionally, the most expressive I had ever seen him. This represents a rather dramatic shift in your approach, Julian. One might even call it impulsive. I prefer to think of it as recalibrating priorities. Julian's hand covered mine briefly on the table, a gesture of solidarity that took me by surprise. Sophia is not a variable in a business equation. She's my daughter. Any arrangements moving forward will prioritize her well-being over corporate considerations. The declaration hung between father and son, a clear challenge to the values that had shaped their relationship for decades. I watched Harold's face, expecting the cold dismissal I had witnessed whenever Julian had previously questioned his father's business wisdom. Instead, something unexpected flickered in the older man's expression, not approval, exactly, but perhaps a reluctant recognition. "Your mother said something similar," Harold said finally, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "When you were about this one's age." He nodded toward Sophia, still absorbed in her coloring. "She told me I was treating you like a future asset instead of a present gift." The admission seemed to surprise Julian as much as it did me. "I don't remember that," he said. "You wouldn't. You were too young." Harold straightened, the momentary vulnerability disappearing behind his usual composed exterior. "Eleanor was right, of course. She often is about such matters. I chose not to heed her warning, and our relationship has reflected that choice ever since." The conversation that followed was unlike any I had witnessed between Julian and his father, still formal by most standards, but punctuated by moments of genuine connection that suggested possibilities neither had explored before. They discussed practical arrangements for Sophia's future, but with consideration for her emotional well-being alongside the financial security that Harold instinctively prioritized. As we prepared to leave, Harold addressed me directly for the first time since his initial greeting. "Miss Bennet," he said, reverting to my maiden name with surprising courtesy, "I owe you an apology. During your marriage to Julian, I viewed you primarily as an addition to our family portfolio rather than as an individual with your own legitimate priorities and perspectives. It was short-sighted and ultimately counterproductive." Coming from Harold Reed, this qualified as effusive contrition. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," I replied, matching his formality. "I appreciate your candor." He nodded, then turned to Sophia, who was gathering her crayons with the serious concentration of a child who has been taught to care for her possessions. "May I have your drawing, young lady? It would look excellent in my office." Sophia considered this with a gravity that made her look startlingly like her father, then carefully tore the page from the children's menu. "This is a hippopotamus wearing a tutu," she explained solemnly as she handed it to him. "He's dancing in the rain." "Excellent composition," Harold replied, examining the purple scribbles with the same attention he might give a quarterly earnings report. "The movement is particularly well captured." It was such an unexpectedly gentle interaction that I found myself re-evaluating yet another Reed family member I had thought I understood completely. That evening, our last in New York before departing for Vienna, Julian came to the hotel for a final discussion of logistics and schedules. Sophia was already asleep, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of meeting so many new people in such a short time. "I've been thinking," Julian began as we sat in the sweet small living area, far enough from the bedroom not to disturb our daughter. "About what you said when you left. About seeing people as assets rather than individuals with intrinsic value. It wasn't something I expected you to remember from my letter," I admitted. "You were fairly preoccupied with the Morgan acquisition at the time." "I remember every word," he said quietly. "I read it so many times I could recite it from memory. Whatever we once had has been systematically dismantled by your inability to see me as anything more than an acquisition to be managed and eventually divested when more advantageous options appeared." Hearing my own words repeated back to me was disorienting. The raw pain of that moment contrasted against the more measured understanding we had reached in recent days. "You were right," he continued. "About all of it. I had stopped seeing you as Olivia, the woman I fell in love with at the Met, and started seeing you as Mrs. Reed, an asset in the family portfolio. I had convinced myself that marriage, like everything else in my life, could be evaluated in terms of performance metrics and return on investment. It wasn't entirely your fault, I found myself saying, surprising us both. With the concession, I participated in the transformation. I allowed myself to become the person you and your family expected rather than remaining the woman you had actually chosen. He nodded, acknowledging the shared responsibility for our failed marriage. That's what I've been trying to understand these past few days. How not to make the same mistake with Sophia. How to see her as a person to be loved rather than a legacy to be managed. The admission contained a vulnerability I had rarely witnessed in Julian, even during our most intimate moments together. It suggested a capacity for growth I hadn't credited him with when I chose to leave rather than confront the issues in our marriage. Start by asking what she wants rather than telling her what she should want, I suggested. Listen when she speaks, even when what she's saying seems trivial or illogical by adult standards. Remember that her value isn't measured by achievements or acquisitions but by her capacity for joy and wonder and connection. Julian smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his features. That sounds remarkably like what you once told me about art conservation, that the value of a painting isn't in its market price but in its ability to evoke emotion across centuries. I had forgotten that conversation, one of many during our early courtship when we had shared perspectives rather than performances. The comparison wasn't inaccurate, both art and children represented value systems that transcended the transactional approach Julian had been raised to prioritize. I'll try, he promised. I can't guarantee I'll always get it right. 38 years of conditioning won't disappear overnight. But I want to be the father Sophia deserves, not the one my father modeled. That's a good place to start, I acknowledged. As he prepared to leave, Julian paused at the door, turning back with an expression I couldn't immediately interpret. Olivia, he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. Thank you. Not just for bringing Sophia to me now, but for protecting her from the person I was 3 years ago. For loving her enough to make the difficult choice you did. The acknowledgement caught me off guard, validating decisions I had questioned repeatedly since that breakfast conversation with Sophia. Thank you for understanding why I left, I replied. And for becoming someone she can safely know now. He nodded once, accepting both the gratitude and the implicit challenge to continue evolving. I'll see you both tomorrow for the airport transfer. With that, he was gone, leaving me to contemplate the strange new territory we were navigating. Not a reconciliation of our marriage, but perhaps the beginning of a more honest relationship than we had managed to build during our years together. 6 months later, sitting in a cafe in Vienna's historic center, watching Julian and Sophia feed pigeons in the square outside, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had transformed since that snowy Boxing Day confrontation. Julian had kept every promise made during those intense days of negotiation. He visited Vienna regularly, maintaining an apartment near ours but never presuming greater intimacy than co-parenting required. He consulted me on decisions affecting Sophia, respected the boundaries I established, and gradually built his own relationship with our daughter independent of my involvement or approval. More surprisingly, he had begun the process of restructuring Reed Enterprises to accommodate his new priorities. The Asian division now operated under a team of executives rather than requiring his constant oversight. Board meetings were scheduled around his visits to Vienna rather than the reverse. When emergencies arose that demanded his presence in New York, he explained his absences to Sophia directly, in age-appropriate terms that emphasized his commitment to return. Harold, after his initial resistance, had embraced his role as grandfather with unexpected enthusiasm. His visits to Vienna were less frequent than Julian's but no less meaningful, each carefully planned to include experiences that would create memories rather than merely transferring Reed family expectations to a new generation. Eleanor had become a regular presence in our lives, her initial reserve transforming into genuine warmth as she developed a relationship with Sophia based on shared interests rather than obligation. She had even begun collecting children's books featuring strong female protagonists, sending them to Vienna with handwritten inscriptions that emphasized character over accomplishment. And I had found unexpected fulfillment in the position that had brought us to Vienna in the first place. The Conservation Consortium valued my expertise, supported my research initiatives, and created a work environment that accommodated rather than compromised my role as Sophia's mother. For perhaps the first time since meeting Julian, I felt fully myself, neither the struggling art student nor the perfect corporate wife, but a woman whose professional and personal identities coexisted in sustainable balance. Julian joined me at the cafe table as Sophia continued her fascination with the pigeons under the watchful eye of a museum guard who had become familiar with her regular visits. "She has your eye for detail," Julian observed, following my gaze to where Sophia was carefully sorting birdseed by size before distribution. "Nothing escapes her notice." "And your determination," I added. "Once she decides on a course of action, nothing distracts her from the goal." Poor child, inheriting the worst of both parents. His smile took any sting from the words. "I've been meaning to discuss something with you." The serious note in his voice triggered a momentary concern. "What is it?" "I've been offered the chairmanship of the European Cultural Heritage Foundation. It would mean relocating to Brussels at least part-time." He hesitated, watching my reaction. "I wanted to get your thoughts before making any decisions, since it would affect my availability here in Vienna." The consideration inherent in the consultation, so different from how decisions have been made during our marriage, wasn't lost on me. "That sounds like an incredible opportunity. Would it mean less time with Sophia?" "Potentially more, actually. The position requires less travel than my current arrangements. I could establish a primary residence here in Vienna, commute to Brussels for the 3 days per week the foundation requires physical presence. My visits would be more frequent but perhaps slightly shorter. I considered this from multiple angles: what it would mean for Sophia's routine, for the co-parenting balance we had established, for Julian's professional satisfaction. "You should accept it," I said finally. "The regular schedule would be good for Sophia. Children thrive on consistency." He nodded, relief evident in his expression. "There's something else," he added, his gaze dropping briefly to his coffee cup before meeting mine again. "Something I've wanted to say for months but haven't found the right moment." The shift in his demeanor alerted me to the significance of whatever would come next. "What is it?" "I still love you, Olivia." The declaration hung between us, unexpected and complicated in its implications. 3 simple words that carried the weight of our shared history, our separate journeys, our careful reconstruction of a relationship built on co-parenting rather than romance. Before I could formulate a response, he continued, "I'm not asking for reconciliation or even forgiveness. I'm not expecting anything to change between us. I just wanted you to know that loving you wasn't something I ever stopped doing, even when I failed completely at showing it." "Julian, please, let me finish." He took a breath, composing himself with visible effort. "These past 6 months have shown me what I couldn't see during our marriage, that love isn't about possession or performance or strategic advantage. It's about wanting someone's happiness even when that happiness doesn't include you. It's about supporting their choices even when those choices take them away from you. It's about seeing them clearly for who they are rather than who you need them to be." The words echoed the lessons I had tried to articulate about parenting Sophia, now applied to adult relationships with equally transformative implications. Julian had not just heard me, he had internalized the perspective in ways that fundamentally altered his approach to connection. "I don't know how to respond to that," I admitted. "You don't need to." He smiled, genuine despite the vulnerability of the moment. "As I said, I'm not expecting anything to change. I simply wanted you to know that I understand now what I couldn't grasp before, that the value of our relationship was never in what it provided or produced, but in how it transformed us both." Sophia ran up to our table then, hands cupped around something she wanted to show us. "Look what I found," she exclaimed, carefully opening her palms to reveal a small, iridescent feather. "It's for both of you to share." We accepted her gift with appropriate appreciation, the moment between us set aside but not forgotten as we focused on our daughter's discovery. The feather passed from her hands to mine to Julian's, a small token unknowingly symbolic of the connection we now shared, not the marriage we had failed to sustain, but something potentially more honest in its recognition of both limitations and possibilities. Later that evening, after Julian had said goodnight to Sophia and prepared to return to his own apartment, I found myself considering his declaration and what it revealed about the man he was becoming rather than the man he had been. "Julian," I said as he gathered his coat from the entryway closet, "what you said earlier, about still loving me. You don't need to address it," he assured me quickly. "I wasn't trying to complicate things between us." "I know. That's not what I wanted to say." I paused, searching for words that would be honest without being hurtful. "I'm not ready to revisit romantic feelings between us. I don't know if I ever will be. Too much happened, too much trust was broken. I understand completely. But I appreciate who you're becoming," I continued. "The father you're choosing to be for Sophia. The way you've respected my decisions and boundaries. The efforts you've made to see value beyond balance sheets and strategic advantages." He nodded, accepting both the limitation and the acknowledgement. "That's enough for now. More than enough, really." As he turned to leave, I found myself adding something I hadn't planned to say: "Maybe someday we could have dinner, just the two of us. Not as co-parents discussing Sophia's schedule. Not as ex-spouses negotiating logistics. Just as two people getting to know each other again." The hope that flickered across his features was quickly controlled, but not before I recognized it for what it was: not expectation, not assumption, but simple appreciation for the possibility being offered. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Whenever you're ready." After he left, I stood at the window of our Vienna apartment, watching as he crossed the street below, his tall figure momentarily illuminated by street lamps before disappearing around a corner. The man walking away was not the Julian Reed I had married, nor the Julian Reed I had left. He was someone new emerging from the constraints of expectation and conditioning, someone who had begun to understand that true value couldn't be calculated on spreadsheets or measured in acquisitions. Sophia appeared beside me in her pajamas, small hand slipping into mine as she joined me at the window. "Did Daddy go home?" "Yes, baby. He'll be back on Thursday for your kindergarten art show." She nodded, accepting this as part of the rhythm of our shared life. "I like when he reads my bedtime stories. He does all the voices." "He's getting better at that," I agreed, remembering the stiff, uncomfortable way Julian had approached those first reading sessions, gradually relaxing into genuine enjoyment of the ritual. "Do you like Daddy now?" The directness of children can be both disarming and illuminating. I considered how to answer honestly while respecting the complexity of adult relationships. "I like who Daddy is becoming," I said finally. "I like how much he loves you and how hard he's working to be a good father." Sophia absorbed this with the solemnity that characterized her approach to important questions. "Maybe someday you could love him again. Like in my books where people who are apart find each other. Out of the mouths of babes, as the saying goes." "Maybe someday," I acknowledged, neither promising nor dismissing the possibility. "For now, we're all learning how to be the family you need, even if it looks different from other families." She seemed satisfied with this, her attention already shifting to whether her favorite stuffed animal had been properly tucked in for the night. I followed her back to her bedroom, helping with the elaborate bedtime ritual she had established, marveling at how this small person had transformed not only my life but Julian's as well, challenging us both to become more than we had been when left to our own devices. If this story has taught you anything, let it be this: people are not assets to be acquired or advantages to be leveraged. They are journeys to be experienced, mysteries to be explored, gifts to be treasured for exactly who they are rather than what they provide. The true value of a human being can never be calculated in dividends or measured in market share. It exists in the capacity to grow beyond limitation, to choose differently when given the chance, to recognize worth that transcends transaction. 3 years after that snowy Boxing Day confrontation, Julian and I continue to navigate the complex territory between our past and our possible future. We are not the same people who met at that art gallery fundraiser, nor the couple whose marriage dissolved under the weight of misaligned values. We are something else entirely: two individuals who have learned through painful experience that genuine connection requires seeing beyond facade to essence, beyond utility to humanity. And Sophia thrives in the space between, love not for what she represents or what she might achieve, but for who she is in each moment of becoming a child whose value was never in question, only the lens through which that value was perceived. If you found meaning in this journey through heartbreak toward healing, please share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their intrinsic worth beyond what they can provide or produce. And subscribe to Mr. Arden's Heart Stories for more tales that illuminate the complex, beautiful, sometimes painful path toward authentic connection in a world that too often reduces people to the sum of their utility. Because in the end, the most valuable currency isn't wealth or power or strategic advantage. It's the courage to see others and yourself with clear eyes and an open heart, recognizing worth that can never be quantified but must always be honored.